Not too many surprises with the brackets, but some things that we do want to point out here. This is our Selection Sunday special for fall 2021 D3FB style here on season 14 of In the Huddle. Frank Rossi, James Baker. We are in the D3FB Huddle. For those of you that aren't aware of who we are, I've got that right there too. I guess I'm too short for my own good. But we have some folks, I'm sure, that have not watched this before. They're tuning in to hear why their team was left out or why their team is facing who they are on the road, at home, or what later rounds look like. So we're going to go through this bracket quarter by quarter, or quadrant by quadrant, I guess we call it. And we'll have Duey Naatz, the selection committee chair, joining us later on in this show. But JB, I always like to give you the first words here as to your takeaways. We didn't have much time to look at the bracket coming into this, obviously, but we did get some information that we got through in terms of questions to Duey. But before we give all that away, your thoughts.
Well, things kind of worked out in certain ways like we thought, and then there were a couple of little surprises here and there because we did see a little bit of inconsistencies going on with the way that each individual rack was working, and it helped certain teams and it kind of sunk others' playoff hopes. So definitely a great field of 32 teams, and we said from day one that there were going to be a handful of one loss and really strong deserving teams that aren't going to get in. It's just the way it goes. And we'll get into some of the financial and geographical, elements of that. But overall, kind of what we expected to a certain extent as far as who are the, number ones potentially and twos, so on and so forth. It's going to be some great football coming up real soon.
So you know by now who the Pool C's were. Let's just kind of review them out loud here. From Region 6, UW-La Crosse and Bethel. Bethel was a wild card with 2 losses. They are the only 2-loss team in the field from Pool C. In Region 5, Wheaton. In Region 4, nobody. Region 3 was Birmingham Southern. Region 2, Johns Hopkins. Region 1, nobody. So the 5 teams again: La Crosse, Bethel, Wheaton, Birmingham Southern, Johns Hopkins. Now, we sort of guess, we can't confirm this, they won't tell us, but here's what we do know. Johns Hopkins was ranked ahead of Ithaca in Region 2. That's how Johns Hopkins can even be picked in that situation, because they have to be on the table. The top team, not picked so far from each region, goes up against each other, those 6 teams from the 6 regions. So Ithaca was blocked by Johns Hopkins. The assumption here is that Ithaca's criteria probably would have trumped Bethel's if it really came down to it, or any other team that would have been on the board that late. I believe Ithaca never got to the table, folks, and that's why you're seeing Johns Hopkins in there, and that was probably the 5th and final Pool C. That's my guess. I think that's your guess as well, seeing how this played out. So we go to the brackets themselves, and I see you have a thought. Go ahead. I don't want to cut you off on it.
Well, it's just, I mean, we had a sense that the way that the Region 2 or Rack 2, whatever you want to call them, they did a lot more of the eye test, and they gave a lot of bump to the Centennial Conference. I mean, when you look at the criteria, Hopkins doesn't necessarily grade out that well, but they have some matchups coming up where they can make a case for themselves. If they could, have a pretty deep playoff run, then maybe they can tell guys like me to shut up. But hey, I'm not surprised they made it in on one hand. But when you look at their resume compared to others, it could be called into question. But just the structure of stuff, like you said, the teams blocked other teams from getting to the table, and that's what happened.
Let's look at the bracket and explain why some of this stuff came together in our own words, and then Duey Naatz will tell us a little bit more after this. And point out any surprises you see along the way here. We're going to start in the upper left-hand portion of the bracket. St. John's Lake Forest. So if you thought there was favoritism for the former chair, Jim Catanzaro, you'll learn right away that's not the case. Undefeated versus undefeated here. That only happens, I believe, twice in the entire bracket of undefeated versus undefeated in the first round, and this is one of 2 times. The other instance of it is actually in this quadrant just below it. Yeah. We'll talk about that in a second. But Lake Forest goes 10-0 after beating Chicago yesterday. St. John's holds on, comes back to win at the last second against Bethel in the MIAC championship. What a game. And there you go. That's the matchup. This is what we call the island quadrant, because below them, you'll see a forced flight no matter who wins in that first round. Linfield and Redlands, they will not have to fly to each other, but somebody's going to have to fly somewhere in the second round, no matter what happens here. And then for the similar reasons, Mary Hardin-Baylor and Trinity, Texas, we looked it up after talking to Duey, and if you hear any discussion about, why not flip the teams here, the answer is it's 700+ miles no matter how you do the permutations of the 4 teams in the bottom part of this quadrant. Mary Hardin-Baylor takes on Trinity, Texas. No flight needed there, but there will be a flight needed in the second round for Birmingham Southern. Huntingdon versus the winner of the Mary Hardin-Baylor Trinity game. There's a rematch there, JB. We'll let Duey tell you why, but your initial thoughts here on this quadrant.
Well, the obvious thing that jumps out to me, Frank, is that it looks like St. John's is the number one. And we talked about whether or not that they would be deserving of that. And I'm sure that some Crew fans are going to be a little disappointed given how highly they've been ranked all season in the national polls. It seems to me that they ended up with effectively a 2 seed in this section. And so that's kind of a surprise to me, especially how St. John's has struggled a little bit. I mean, they lost their starting QB, and that's part of the issue. But it does seem that St. John's, who I made a case for last week as a possible number one, ended up in that situation.
Are you surprised or upset at all that Bethel was a choice for Pool C in terms of losing twice with a SOS around 570, give or take? Granted, losses were both to the same team, St. John's. Does it bother you at all that a team like Hardin-Simmons with 1 loss is left out, even Merchant Marine at 1 loss is left out, and Bethel is selected in this situation?
Kind of, yeah. Especially with how close Hardin-Simmons gave the Crusaders such a good run for their money. But ultimately, when you look at the bracket, Frank, there's a sort of a natural sort of southwestern pod here that we talked about before. There's a couple of Texas teams, a couple of teams from Alabama. They matched up well, and clearly the committee saw that as an obvious situation. And unfortunately, there's only 4 spots, and Hardin-Simmons just couldn't work their way in there.
And I was a little exuberant to get you the bottom left portion of the bracket here up, and so now we've got it up here at the right timing, and we'll see that it is Wisconsin-Whitewater hosting Greenville. That makes sense. That's not like an undefeated versus undefeated there. And we believe that Whitewater, as a result of being positioned here, is another 1 seed ultimately. Yep. DePaul versus Rose-Hulman, which is kind of I'm not sure. It's going to be a good game, I think, but I'm not sure 8-2 versus 8-2 how you put that together. Although DePaul is a deceiving 8-2, technically 8-1 versus D3 opponents this season. Central versus Bethel, that's a pretty strong game if you're really giving Bethel that level of touting by picking them as a Pool C with 2 losses. So that's kind of the head scratcher for me, is why the selection of DePaul, Rose-Hulman, and then Central Bethel to face each other here. And then Wheaton versus Aurora. Aurora, look, it's kind of ironic. They lose to North Central pretty badly, and Wheaton, who narrowly loses to North Central, is now the other CCIW team that will have to actually host Aurora in this situation. So, a little bit of irony there to see if they play better against Wheaton than they did against North Central Aurora in this quadrant. Your thoughts on the bottom left?
Yeah, well, initially because I seem to recall in years past, Frank, that the bottom, where the position that Wheaton's on the bracket right now would be considered the 2 seed, but I think in the way this bracket's designed, that's actually Central, and so Wheaton would be effectively like your 3 in this situation, and a lot of people are going to think that the Thunder are going to, probably work their way, out of here and ultimately end up facing Whitewater in the quarterfinals. But the Central team seems really strong, really loaded. Blaine Haskins has got some crazy statistics. So if there was any possible sort of dark horse, I think, at least on this left side of the bracket to make it into the national semifinals, it could be Central.
I agree with you. They're kind of that unknown quantity to a certain degree. We learn little pieces about them throughout the season, and even in the spring, they look like a decent team, but we could never put our finger on just how strong they might be, even through the spring, through the fall. They've
And let's face it, Frank,
handily winning.
And let's face it, I just I would sit back and just love to watch you and the guys try to do a Central versus North Central national championship game.
It's North Central here.
Yeah,
Central North Central. Oh my God! Okay,
that would be it's a long shot, but
the one I want though. One I've always wanted is Union Mount Union, and it still hasn't happened after all these years, and it almost happened I think this go around. So. There is there are two of the quadrants. Let's go to the bottom right. We'll just go rotational here, and look at the Mount Union quadrant. Speak of the devil. It is Mount Union versus Washington and Lee, and I got to think that Washington and Lee made this an easy matchup for the committee by losing yesterday and giving them this opportunity to pair them up. And this has got to be somewhere right in that vicinity of that 500 to 600 miles. I didn't look beforehand, but it seems like a long trip.
Yeah, I mean, that part of Southern Virginia to Central Ohio has got to be, pushing the 500s, 50 marker thereabouts. I was really convinced that they would pair up Washington, Lee, and Salisbury just based on the little more geographic proximity. But this matchup kind of makes sense,
393.
Really? Oh, so it's not as far as
I would think.
So that might have solved the equation there, because obviously a team from Worcester like Anna Maria or Framingham for that matter to Alliance might be around the same ballpark. So they had a number of choices. This is kind of what I'll call like the Pennsylvania Mid-Atlantic bracket. Ultimately, Mount Union is going to be favored to come out of it. It looks like the committee actually, gave the 2 seed to Del Val, and so you'd have to assume that if both the Aggies and the Mules win their respective games, that Battle of Pennsylvania. And we did say back in 2019 that we thought that perhaps the two best teams from the formerly East region were Muhlenberg and Del Val. They didn't get to play each other, but now they will, and we'll see who comes out on top for a chance to probably try to knock off Mount Union if they can.
Well, once upon a time, they weren't actually. Muhlenberg was in the south while Del Val was in the east, but they still wouldn't put them together despite all that fact. Mm-hmm. So we're now with them both in, actually Del Val in Region 1 and Muhlenberg in Region 2. They finally decided to go cross-region for that type of matchup, and it will be interesting, I think. But then, look, a little bit of irony in the other way. And, of course, Del Val and Muhlenberg have to win their first-round games. I should not take anything for granted in this one. We talk about this stuff. But in the first round itself, Maryland, it's going to be a battle of Salisbury and Johns Hopkins. Now, it's not as close as you think in terms of distance, because the peninsula that Salisbury is on, you still have to take some interesting paths to get over to Baltimore. It can be a hellacious drive in traffic. So it is not exactly a hop, skip, and a jump for those wondering. Maybe on a Saturday morning it will be next week. But Salisbury, Johns Hopkins, and there's Johns Hopkins, probably your last Pool C team. They should be playing the "we're just happy to be here" game, and maybe they come out and just say we're in the house money right now, so let's go out and give it all against Salisbury, who we don't know if it'll be Billy Gant or Jack Lanham as quarterback for Salisbury. Ultimately, I didn't look in the box score yesterday to see who started, but obviously Lanham was fighting injuries, trying to come back. Billy Gant's done a good job for Salisbury in the meantime. Del Val, Anna Maria. Hey, Anna Maria, congratulations. We didn't get to say it much yesterday, but Coach Mulroney and company, unbelievable story there. For those that don't know it, look up all the times we've talked about the idea of Mulroney and what he's about over there and how he's just ignited that team out of nowhere into a playoff situation this year. And kudos to Anna Maria for patience in terms of the administration with what he was delivering there, and he got it to work. Muhlenberg and Framingham State, if this game was 10 weeks ago, it would be Muhlenberg all day, every day. This Framingham State team is a different team from what we saw scrimmage Rockport back when, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
I believe that was the scrimmage they had. It's just night and day. Tom Kelly deserves so many kudos. It's got to be him versus Maroney for Coach of the Year in Region 1.
No, absolutely. I mean, the Rams are a totally different team now, and they really separated themselves from the pack and the MASCAC, dominating particularly, Bridgewater State in the last, basically championship game. This is not a slam dunk win for Coach Milne and the Mules. They'll have a sizable defensive and offensive lines to deal with from Framingham. They're going to bring their best shot at Muhlenberg, and even though the Mules will be favored, this could be one of the more interesting, potentially closer first round games. We'll see.
And in the upper right, let's go to North Central Carnegie Mellon. I mean, by win-loss record, it makes sense, but I feel like it's almost more of a distance necessity than anything else that they did this to Carnegie Mellon, because Carnegie Mellon played some strong teams and won against some strong teams as well. So it's a little tough to see this one as a first-round matchup for some folks. Then Albion hosting La Crosse.
Okay.
I can't figure out. I mean, remember, La Crosse has one loss to Grand Valley State, which is D2. So technically, I don't know how they would grade out lower than Albion, is such that Albion's hosting, but apparently that's what happened. We'll have to take them at face value here for what they did here. SUNY Cortland hosting Springfield. This makes sense, obviously, with the 3 losses for Springfield. And it'll be interesting to see the triple option team against Cortland to see if shortening the game against Cortland, somehow they could sneak a win in. It's not impossible for the Springfield team to do that. And Endicott hosting RPI. We do talk about this in the interview. We'll get to this in a minute, so we won't spoil the information. But it is the more losses hosting the less losses in this situation. And that is all D3 losses. That's not like a Albion versus La Crosse scenario, for instance. So take note. We'll be asking about that in a second. But again, your thoughts on the upper right-hand quadrant of this bracket.
Yeah, it's funny, some of the teams where they've been seeded and who's hosting and who's not is just kind of not what you would expect. But I think at the end of the day, there may be some liberties taken over the fact that North Central has been so dominant that, other than maybe, La Crosse and NCC in the second round, it will be must-see TV. But yeah, whoever wins that game is going to be heavily favored to come out of this bracket with a shot at the national championship.
I think it's time to bring in our selection committee chairman, Duey Naatz. The last time he was selection committee chair was actually in 2016, so he came back for more. Apparently he enjoyed it so much he wanted to do it again. But Duey Naatz has been a friend of the show that year when he came on, and when we've seen him out as just a normal committee member before being chair again. He's always been warm and welcoming, and truly Wisconsin. You'll notice that about him through and through. And that's one of the things we do love about him. He is simple in terms of his answers. He doesn't try to give you the runaround, and it's refreshing to say the least. Just like Jim Catanzaro. Jim had the same, I think, wherewithal to understand trying to play the semantics game doesn't work, especially with the number of years we've been doing this. So it's good to have a straight shooter talk to us. Here is our selection committee chair for this year, Duey Naatz, in our discussion with him. Dewey, it's been a few years. Great to see you this time. Last time was on audio, and we do appreciate your time after what I know has been a long couple of days and weeks for that matter for selection committee. I just want to jump in right away here with the first question that a lot of people have been wondering. Normally we have a 4-region system, or previously at least, we had a 4-region system with, I believe, 2 co-chairs in each region. So there were 8 voices at least in every call from what I remember. How does it work now? How did this change things to going to 6 regions for this part of the selection process that you're involved with?
Well, just going back to how the process worked, I think you had a little bit different breakdown and a smaller group of people, a smaller group of conferences and schools to look at within each region. So I think it helped us dial down and drill down a little bit further. We were a little apprehensive going in because it's always been a 4-region bracket and really kind of put itself together that way. But the 6 regions, it was different to begin with. But I think as things came to the table yesterday and throughout the last couple of weeks of rankings, we figured out a pretty good plan. And I think it actually, when we got to selecting Pool C's, having 6 teams on the board at one time made a difference and kind of helped dial things in a little bit better for the national committee. So it worked out pretty well.
And just to be clear, is there just one representative from each region in the 6-way process, or is it 2 still per?
It's 1 per region is the plan, so that's where it's going to be at, and it worked out pretty well, like I said.
So Dewey, one of the things that obviously the football fans out there will immediately focus in on with the bracket are the Pool C teams. They've been revealed. We know who they are. Maybe some commentary on like what was the experience like, overseeing that this time around.
It's really hard, as it always is. This bracket is very difficult to dial in when you have 5 at-larges across a country of really, really good football teams. It gets really hard when it comes down to selecting those final 5 teams that get an opportunity to play another week. So the process I think is a good one. It evolves and revolves around the accomplishments of each of those teams, the strength of schedule, they're across everything. So it's not just one category, it's everything. So their entire body work is important. It's hard, it's difficult, but I think the racks across the region, across the country, did a good job of seeding those teams appropriately, and that makes our job as a national committee when we start looking at those at-large teams that much easier for us. So it wasn't easy, and there's good football teams that aren't in this tournament like every other year, but I think the committee really did a pretty good job on getting the best at-large teams we could.
Let's discuss a couple of the teams that might be looking at this saying, what the heck? They're 1-loss teams, essentially. Hardin-Simmons, Merchant Marine are both 1-loss teams that were left out. And Bethel is a 2-loss team that comes in. Now, there was a lot of discussion out there about how do you treat a team like Bethel that loses twice to the same opponent in terms of St. John's. And obviously yesterday was with virtually 0 on the clock. They lose that game against St. John's. A quality team, quality SOS, but not trying to put words into your mouth, but the 2-loss versus 1-loss scenario is tough for some people to swallow. We want to give you the opportunity to lay out why that happens, especially to a team like Hardin-Simmons that had a narrow loss to Mary Hardin-Baylor earlier in the season.
It's difficult. It really is, and the teams that you're mentioning are very good football teams, and it's too bad this bracket isn't bigger and we can put 10 more teams in it that deserve the opportunity. But I think as a committee and as the RAC groups in each region, everybody has to look at each team's entire body of work. So that involves strength of schedule. It involves win percent. You guys know and understand what that involves. But I think a lot of it came down to numbers of wins versus ranked opponents was a key component. And I think having those 6 regions that we talked about made a difference in numbers of wins and games against ranked opponents. So my heart goes out to those teams. I've had good football teams in the past that have stayed home because we just didn't have enough wins and wins, and it's hard. It really is, and I feel for those teams. But I think as a whole, the entire body work, I think our committee and the RACs across the country did a good job.
Yeah, certainly. And although we have noticed, at least in this iteration, that teams from conferences that only really get that one out of conference game, and their strength of schedule is kind of affected by that, may have gotten a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. I mean, we saw Hopkins getting in. Their SOS wasn't necessarily as strong as, let's say, like an Ithaca's, but they only have the one loss to the conference champion. I mean, were some of those things factored in with these conferences that have a larger slate they have to go through, and it kind of affects their SOS accordingly?
Yeah, it's difficult, and we are aware of, but it isn't a criteria, is the number of non-conference games that some of these teams can play across the country. So some conferences, you only have the ability to play one out-of-conference game, and maybe only have an opportunity to play two, and that affects your strength. So one guaranteed way to get in this tournament is to win the AQ. And that's difficult, as we all know, because there's some great football teams across the country. That's the only guaranteed way to get in the tournament. And if you're not going to win your conference, you need to play good non-conference games and beat them. But the hard part of that is, like you guys mentioned, is the ability to schedule those games is difficult for certain conferences too. It's travel related, it's cost related, it's where other conferences may not want to play that, so there's a lot of pieces that go into it, but it makes it really hard, and we try to do the best we can as all committees do across all sports. So
we've heard in the past that primary criteria are tough to just use without going to the secondary criteria when it comes to football because of the lack of results. In some of the secondary criteria include expanding to your entire win-loss record, and possibly looking at the last quarter of the season when there's really close scenarios between teams. Did you find a need to go to secondary criteria when it came to Pool C selection, especially because of some of the closeness of some of these teams?
Yeah, I think to a point, we really try to stick to the primary criteria as much as we can. And I think most people understand in football with 10 games, the difficulty of just those criteria is really hard. If we could play 40 football games, I think the primary criteria would take care of everything. So it doesn't. So we look at all of the pieces. So at times I do believe the secondary criteria becomes that next step that can help a committee try to dial in a little bit tighter. So absolutely.
Dewey, did basically the missed season last year due to COVID, and obviously, many schools have had their budgets impacted. The NCAA has obviously had its budget impacted across the board. Were those financial considerations something that the national committee had to factor into some of these choices? I mean, it looks like there aren't going to be a ton of flights until probably quarterfinal round. We're seeing a rematch of Huntington and Birmingham, which is maybe due to cost measures. Could you speak a little bit on that point?
Yeah, I think as a national committee and I've worked with this committee in the past, and I think cost and budget impact at our level is always a factor. And I think it's something that we always keep at the back of our mind, or maybe even a little bit closer to the front than that, is we have to be conscious of that and use that to some extent as we put a bracket together, because budget does have an impact. And things are a little tight right now across the country and everywhere. So, I mean, common sense, it's something we took into consideration and we needed to. So,
Now,
Makes
some
sense.
people would ask the question, why not pair Mary Hardin-Baylor with one of Birmingham Southern or Huntingdon just to avoid the rematch situation between Birmingham Southern and Huntingdon? Can you speak to maybe why that rematch was so necessary? Is there a 600-mile scenario there that I'm not seeing? Why force the rematch in round one, which we know is one of the things that is attempted to be avoided, although this is a non-conference rematch, which we know does get a certain level of forgiveness ultimately between Birmingham Southern and Huntingdon?
I think part of the discussion as a group when we started to talk about it was the fact that with the 2020 season and not having a championship bracket, that most of the players on these teams that are in the tournament maybe haven't played against each other. So that year after year matchup that maybe used to take place or was something that happened more often, that we felt this time around going back to those closer matchups in certain situations to avoid flights was warranted, and an opportunity for new coaches, new players to play against teams and help us keep that budget focus in our in our back of our mind, I guess. So
Yeah, I think before we got on the air, Frank was going to mention this one, but I guess I'll steal it from him. We just wanted to clarify, one of the things that might jump out to the East Region fans who follow us and who've known our show for a while. The RPI, going on the road in the first round, playing at Endicott, that wasn't a situation that the president of RPI basically said no home game. This was actually a decision that kind of came out through the seeding and ranking process. Is that correct?
Yeah, as we start to put the bracket together, the top or ranked teams within regions, as we started to put the bracket together, typically were hosts for the first round games, if that makes sense. So as far as RPI and anything with their institution, that was not part of the discussion as far as deciding who hosted or didn't. It has more to do with where teams are ranked within their regions in comparison as we put the bracket together. So.
And one thing we should know is, and we didn't get a chance to mention this on our Friday show, Shirley Jackson, president of RPI, did change some of the approach on fan rules for their athletic events. So it would have actually allowed in some format, it sounds like, the ability to host. So this is just to get rid of all the conspiracy theorists out there. This was completely a criteria-based decision, as you just said.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so looking at the overall bracket, the upper left is obviously the teams, kind of, we call them the island teams in terms of the 600-mile rule affects them the most, and you've minimized flights with them. Were there any other locational challenges when you put this together? For instance, we've always heard that there's so many East Region teams, especially in the New England area. Did you feel a need to break from, let's say, using criteria and trying to keep groupings of the 1, 8, 2, 7, 3, 6, 4, 5, all that stuff? Were you at all challenged in that respect because of the density of teams in certain zones that we see in Division III?
Yeah, and I think as we're conscious of budget and trying to keep things in matchups and things as we go through the bracket, there's always challenges that pop themselves up. And okay, how can we get a team to play this and provide that quality championship experience without putting somebody on a bus for 598 miles because it fits right under the window? This is a new pilot because of certain travel restrictions and the difficulty with some flights nowadays that, as you start putting that together, and I think the East Coast, is a little bit easier sometimes because there's more schools that are in close proximity. I think some of the more difficult pieces come into like you guys mentioned, the island schools or the Northwest or the West Coast and the Texas, but you also run into that sometimes in the Midwest as far as, because the Midwest reaches a long way. So I think the committee did a good job of getting some different matchups, but yet still keeping the budget in the back of our mind as we put the bracket together. So.
If I could follow up on one thing, JP,
Sure.
Nationally we try to, or it sounds like the committee tries, and we try along with you now, to figure out who the ones and the twos are to start potting up from there. And by pods, 4 teams, including that team. And so you try to take the top 8 teams, it sounds like, every year, assign ones and twos, and then go from there. If I'm reading this correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong if you can, it seems like the ones were St. John's, Whitewater, Mount Union, and North Central. Were those the natural number ones, or was there another geography factor that came in that maybe prevented, for instance, a Mary Hardin Baylor from being a 1? And let me just ask you the other question, which is, did you have to use the results in previous years' playoff results to basically create who your number ones and number twos were for the undefeated teams?
Well, I'm going to answer this politically correct, and we don't seed the bracket, but obviously as you start to put together games with the top ranked regional teams, obviously you can see who home games are and who's hosting and things like that. But you know what, a year like this, pretty, as far as ones and twosies, that it really doesn't come into play. I think there's a lot of 1-loss teams and 0-loss teams that are very good football teams, and I think as a committee we think anybody can win that. So it's an unseeded bracket, so I can't sit here and say this team and that team is who is where and what, but as far as good football teams that could potentially match up and meet each other at some point, I think that's what a bracket's for. So I think there's some fantastic matchups in this bracket, and they're going to happen fairly early in the tournament, which I think looking back at the other years I served on this committee, this year the number of undefeated and 1-loss teams is more or higher than it's ever been. So I think there's going to be some great first-round games, but second round, third round opportunities were some teams that it's going to be pretty interesting bracket.
Dewey, from what we hear last go around in 2019, the final team selected, and you don't have to confirm this, we know somebody that kind of sort of did, but we won't name names on this. The final team selected wins the national championship ultimately. And so we're not asking you who the final team is, but we're kind of asking you to give some advice out there, or some thoughts about how important Pool C is in the mix, and how long did it really take you to pick those 5 teams, and how long did it take you to put the entire bracket together, for that matter? What is the kind of distribution of time that you have to put into this scenario for Pool C and then the bracketing itself?
There's a lot of time, and there's a lot of difficulty when you get down to those. And our racks, we started meeting with our regional committees 2 or 3 weeks ago, got started with those, and I think we've really, as a national committee, drilled down into those racks to make sure they do their homework, that they're ranking the teams the way they should be, and not because, I think that team's better because they have a really good quarterback or a good wide receiver, and their defense is just so good that they actually use the criteria. And when the RAC does a good job, it makes the national committee's job easier, because we don't have to. We have the information from how the RAC discussed and talked through things when we get to hammer things out. So it takes a little longer because we have to wait till the West Coast and the last games of the final game of the Saturdays finish up, and then our RACs start with their meetings, and those take anywhere from a 15-minute meeting to an hour, depending upon if there was upsets yesterday or different things. Our national committee then goes through and looks at each region once they're all done. And last night, I think our last regional call was Region 6, and because of West Coast games, and looked at that. So that was, I think our call last night was at 8 o'clock. And then when that's done, the national committee gets together. We talk through and look at to make sure each RAC in each region is seated the way it should be. At that point, then we start getting into the Pool C discussion of which teams we think are worthy of that. And like I said, there's 8, 9, or 10 of those teams out there that were worthy, and how you go through that. So each region then puts up their top at-large candidate onto the board. And then we talk about those 6 schools. And when I mentioned it before, that used to be 4 schools on the board. So when we were 4 regions, it was 4. Last night when we put 6 up there, I think that helped us as a national committee. You could see a little bit more division between those 6 schools and just having 4 up on the board. So I think it takes time. I think we left the offices last night about midnight. So by, last night, it still takes time to vote and talk through those Pool Cs. Once we did that, then we kind of get a preliminary bracket put together. We finalized that this morning and begins working on site reps and who's going to host and that whole process and officials. So it takes a while. But I think we owe it to the teams out there to do our due diligence and make sure that we hammer away at the entire body of work of everything they've done to do the best job we can at the top 5 at-large that we can. Is there going to be teams unhappy they didn't make it that are worthy? They do deserve to be in it. Yeah, I wish we could expand our bracket because, as a coach many years ago, I was there, and it hurts, but you got to do the best you can. And I think our committee works really hard to take the time to do it right, and I hope we did. And this tournament looks to be a fantastic tournament, so we're excited to get it going next week.
And we are excited as well.
I was just going to say, Duey, I mean, I think you guys did a great job. There were obviously certain constraints that have to be, taken into consideration. We've been saying since day one that there was going to be at least, a handful of teams that deserve to get in that probably won't just because there isn't enough room. But at the end of the day, don't yell at Frank. Don't yell at Pat Coleman or D3Football.com. We didn't pick the field, right?
Don't yell at me.
Yeah, no, I'm not gonna yell at you, Duey. It's one of those things. It's just you guys have a lot of professionals, a lot of people who know this way better than fans do. So,
one thing I want to say though, and I know he's the backbone. We say this every time we have the chair on. He's in the background over there. He doesn't have to appear. JP Williams, the liaison for football, among other sports, is a tremendous asset to your committee. We know that. And real quick, you can thank him, obviously, but we always want to give you the final word, Duey, on just the overall thought of the process. Anything you think could be improved in the process, anything like that. Floor is yours here for a couple minutes. Duey, and again, thank you for joining us.
Well, first thing, I do want to thank JP Williams and the NCAA for allowing me the opportunity. This is my chance as a former football coach and director of athletics to give back to the game of football and be involved in a small way. And it helps me stay in it, I guess, a little bit. So I've appreciated that. I appreciate D3 football and the work that you guys do to promote our game and our game at this level. This, in my mind, is the best level of football. The kids and student athletes that are out there competing at this level are doing it because they love the game of football combined with their educational experience. And I feel privileged just to be a part of it. So thank you, D3 football. Thank you, NCAA. And good luck to all the teams in the bracket. We're excited to get this thing going.
Thank you to Duey Naatz. Thank you to JP Williams for organizing that. Every year we always kind of shudder at the thought that maybe they're not going to do this with us and everything else, but they trust us enough to allow us to pre-record this before. You'll get to see it, and we do our best here to make sure that everything is tight-lipped and this doesn't release until afterward, and we do appreciate their trust in that. I shouldn't say we try to do it. We do it. We are as good as it gets there. The overall takeaway for me personally, I think it's a good bracket. I think there are some questions like every year. They can't project out flights necessarily in the second or third rounds, but I think there is a certain mandate that when the NCAA looks at the bracket before they approve it, they want to make sure that there aren't these possibilities for these, endless flights in the second and third rounds. And that's what this bracket sort of ensures. North Central, Cortland, I think, is a risk of a flight ultimately in a quarterfinal scenario. So you might have a couple opportunities for that. I'm going to confirm that as I speak here. But
it definitely is, because when I moved from Geneva in upstate New York and drove to Chicago, which is, not too far from Naperville, that's about a 12-hour drive. That's a lot of miles.
739 to be exact. So, and that uses the official calculator that the NCAA uses. It is as the crow flies, I believe, I think it uses best routes. Now I'm thinking about this, but nonetheless, you get the point that there is a possibility for a flight in that quadrant. And again, we'll put that one up just so you can see what we mean by that. But overall, JB, I think this is a pretty good effort by them. I don't agree necessarily with what Region 2 did in terms of their ordering of teams. I'm not going to lie about that. I think they could have done better there. And given Ithaca the benefit of the doubt, we will see the regional rankings probably tomorrow. The final set of regional rankings. That might give us a little bit more information of why they went this way. Maybe they gave extra regionally ranked opponents to Johns Hopkins or less to Ithaca because of the shakeout of yesterday's losses and wins. Ultimately, we'll see for sure. Most likely in the afternoon on Mondays when it's last couple of go-arounds been released to us. But your thoughts, final thoughts here?
No, I think it's going to be, a great tournament. You can already see, in the first round, there's going to be some really great games. We have a couple of rematches, which, unfortunately, happens every year. But, I'm really looking forward to some of these. Like, that Central Bethel game, looks great. Wheaton Aurora could be really interesting. Cortland Springfield too, like you said, Frank. How does the triple option, work? In the dead of winter in upstate New York, and Hopkins Salisbury as well. So there's no shortage of interesting matchups. And not surprisingly, there are some very clear favorites who we think are going to advance all the way into the Final Four. What gets tricky, though, really that upper left-hand corner, when you look at the fact you have St. John's, Linfield, Mary Hardin Baylor. Those are all big names in Division III, and so that's pretty tightly packed up in there. It'll be interesting to see if the Crusaders can get through that run there and make it to the semifinals. Watch out.
We will have ECAC Bowl pairing announcements on Monday around 12:30 p.m. We'll update the exact time as we get closer. We want to make sure we have enough leeway to get you the graphics and information you need. So for now, it's projected at 12:30 Eastern Time on Monday. And you'll hear other bowl pairings from the New England Bowls and the, MAC CC Bowls that are coming up as well. Yep. There is no New York Bowl this year. That is obsolete now. So some of the teams that would have been in the running for that did put in to be in the ECACs as well. And we don't know if we're going to have 3 or 4 in the end. That's being determined, I think, as we speak, ECAC Bowl games. So we'll probably surprise you with the information tomorrow as to what the final decision is on 3 or 4 bowl games for the ECAC. Thanks again to everyone at the NCAA for working with us for this show, and we will see you Monday.